Okay. So, good evening. Welcome to Holy Saturday evening. We're going to just have a chance to. We're going to have a short reflection this evening on the sort of summary of the Passion narrative that we've been exploring during the week, and of the resurrection, which we celebrate at the vigil tonight here in the church on Bere Island at 9 o'clock. And I'd like to begin this evening with a short reading from the ancient homily, the 2nd century homily that I mentioned this morning. It's the one that has that memorable phrase, "You and I form one undivided person." This is how it begins. Something strange is happening. There is a great silence on earth today, a great silence and stillness. The whole earth keeps silence because the king is asleep. The earth trembled and is still because God has fallen asleep in the flesh, and he has raised up all who have slept ever since the world began. God has died in the flesh, and hell trembles with fear. He has gone to search for our first parent as for a lost sheep. I was saying this morning how we can see the journey of Christ after the crucifixion as this journey through the layers of history and the layers of consciousness, the layers of creation. And in the readings of the vigil tonight, we do a great overview of the whole history from the first lines of Genesis, the God made heaven and earth, up to the resurrection, which is seen as a fulfillment, and not a completion in a way, but a fulfillment and a boost for this whole evolutionary progress of creation. But what Jesus is doing is penetrating deep into the foundations of creation and bringing consciousness to it, and then rises up through it, and is still rising up through it, and transforming the whole of creation through his risen consciousness. Greatly desiring to visit those who live in darkness and in the shadow of death, he has gone to free from sorrow the captives Adam and Eve, he who is both God and the son of Eve. So the crucial thing here is to see the resurrection, as we'll see in a moment, as the early church saw it, as a sign of liberation, of freedom, and to be free from sorrow. And then at the end of this homily he says, "Rise, let us leave this place," reminding, so leave the grave, in the same way that Jesus said to his disciples in Gethsemane, "Up, rise, we have to go forward now and get on with it." So rise, let us leave this place. The enemy led you out of the earthly paradise. I will not restore you to that paradise. So it's not going back. This is an evolution. This is progress. But I will enthrone you in heaven. I forbade you the tree that was only a symbol of life, but see, I, who am life itself, am now one with you. So the resurrection is this, we could say in a way, a liberation from duality, from our always being separated from our source, separated from God. And because of what has happened in the incarnation, the resurrection allows this deep, radical transformation of our human nature to begin. It's not to say that has finished yet, just as we don't achieve it, once and for all in the course of our life. But this has begun. This is the new life that the resurrection feast is all about. So I, who am life, am now one with you. And throughout the later part of the Gospel of John, Jesus is at the Last Supper and afterwards is speaking about this union or oneness between him and the Father and between him and us. So everything is resolving or revolving back into this oneness from which everything began, but now it's conscious, now it's coming again to this oneness at the right moment in history, the right moment in time. And we are part of that, and if we see that, we are living already in the new age. So I appointed cherubim to guard you as slaves are guarded, but now I make them worship you as God. So a very strong statement here. The resurrection of Jesus enhances the dignity of the human creature. We're higher than the angels, and this was the world view of the time. So we're higher than the angels, who will now worship us, the human, as God. As God. The throne formed by the cherubim awaits you. The bridal chamber is adorned. The banquet is ready. The eternal dwelling places are prepared. The treasure houses of all good things lie open. The kingdom of heaven has been prepared for you from all eternity. So the resurrection is a game changer in religious history and in the understanding of the relationship of the human to the divine or to ultimate reality. And I was referring this morning to Julian of Norwich's idea of the great deed, that the world is still a sinful place. It still shocks us when we read the news, listen to the news about what human beings are capable of, the cruelty, the selfishness, and the ignorance that we are capable of. And so she's very aware of that. But she still affirms that the meaning of creation, the meaning of life, is love. Well, our immediate proof of that is that love is the most important element in our lives. Doesn't matter how much success you have, how much fame, how much celebrity, how many awards you get given. What matters in your life is love. Have you learned to love? Can you come to the end of your life surrounded by people who love you or filled with the knowledge of their love for you? When the people on the planes at 9/11 were going down, they knew their time had come. What did they do? They didn't phone their stockbroker. They phoned their wives, their husbands, their children, their lovers, their friends, and to say, I love you, as all they wanted to affirm at that moment. So this is Julian. This is the mystical theology of the Christian tradition, expressed here very strongly through Julian of Norwich, Dame Julian. And but so she looks at the world. She says, well, if the meaning is love, why is it such a mess? Why is there so much darkness and depravity? And that doesn't shake her faith that love is the meaning of it all, of creation, of all that is happening. But she says, I know that there will be a great deed done. We don't know when or how or what it will be, but all will be made well through this great deed. This is how she describes it. I just referred to it today, but this is the... This is the great deed, ordained by our Lord God from eternity past, treasured and hidden in his blessed heart, only known to himself. And by this great deed he shall make all things well. For just as the Holy Trinity made all things from nothing, So the same Blessed Trinity, which is our symbol of love, shall make well all that is not well. For this is the great deed that our Lord shall do, the deed by which he will keep his word in all things, and shall make all well that is not well. And how the deed shall be done, there is no creature under Christ that knows or shall know it until it is done, so far as I understood the Lord's meaning at this time in her revelation. So the resurrection, faith in the resurrection, produces this ultimate hope. Remember, faith isn't just about belief, intellectual belief or getting the catechism answers correct. Faith is relationship above all, and fidelity to a relationship, to a commitment, to a promise. And so faith in the resurrection is not primarily an intellectual solution. Even that's one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, said he believed in the resurrection, but he said not intellectually, there is no intellectual explanation for it, but by love. He said, I know this through the knowledge of love. And the Dalai Lama, who obviously is not a Christian, but thought deeply about the resurrection during the Good Heart seminar, which you can watch online on our channel, when we offered him a number of gospel texts to read, he read them very deeply and clearly in the light of his Buddhist training and his very own contemplative wisdom and his intelligence. And when he came to the resurrection, which was the last text we gave him, the first one I think was on the Beatitudes, and he said, "This I can buy this," he said, as a Buddhist completely. This is about cause and effect, you know. Happy are the poor in spirit, for they shall have the kingdom of God. But progressively the texts that he commented on were more specifically Christian. And this is something we should be aware of when we read our scriptures, that there are parts of our scriptures that express a universal wisdom and are stronger for that. But there are also aspects of our scriptures which are very specific. And the resurrection is one of them, as the Dalai Lama pointed out. He said, this does not describe reincarnation. This does not describe sort of resuscitation. This is something uniquely Christian. So the resurrection is something we approach with this perception, this perspective of faith. And if we are related to it and related to the risen Jesus, however, much it may be a first date, a couple who marry and have 50 or 60 years of great marriage had to have a first date or had to meet somewhere, and may not even have liked each other very much on the first meeting. A cousin of mine was recently some years ago, was being pursued by a man at a wedding who wanted to sit next to her, and she ended up sort of walking him away, rejecting him completely, and was engaged to him in 3 months. So the first, your first encounter with Christ may not be, love at first sight, but there's something about the message, about the word, the living word that is communicated, maybe through other people, maybe through a community that you meet, maybe through a remembering of your early spiritual formation, or maybe for all sorts of reasons, something in you connects or reconnects to Christ. So it's the beginning. So wherever you are in this journey of faith, the resurrection offers itself to us as ultimately a source of new vision, a new way of looking at humanity, at the human condition. We've been looking at the human condition in the light of the Passion narrative this week. Well, this is the climax of that. The resurrection gives us a quite new vision of the meaning of human existence, with its shadow sides as well as its radiant side. So this great deed of hope that Julian foresees grows out of this faith, out of this connection, connection to the resurrection, the risen Christ. What this suggests to us, therefore, is that the resurrection is this great charge of energy that has not been spent yet. In fact, it's gathering momentum. It's still building up to its full potential in the transformation of the human condition. You may be discouraged by that at times, or discouraged about believing in it because the evidence around you is still of human misery and suffering. But at other times, you'll be able to see that through your own experience and how you yourself have evolved on your spiritual journey, and when somebody comes to meditation, this is a new beginning of their spiritual journey, the contemplative dimension of their faith. They may have lived that faith, deeply and religiously and genuinely for many years, and then, it ceases to be a plateau anymore, and something opens up. This contemplative dimension presents itself to you, and you have to start again in a way. You have to recommit yourself to the learning process, and you learn a lot in that process. And today we know Christianity, particularly in its homelands and in the Western world, is going through a crisis. This crisis may well be a sign of evolution. If you look at the statistics and if you try to think of how can we get people back into church, how can we restore Christianity to if the influence that it had for so many hundreds of years, that may be completely the wrong approach to take. And it doesn't seem as if it's working anyway, even if there's a means of following that policy or that approach. So something quite new is being unpacked for us. And the resurrection is the one constant. The continuity that takes us through these different phases of Christian life. And this is what Simone Weil, the great French mystic and philosopher and heart and mind, who died in 1943, I think, before she was 40. This is what she perceived. She came from a Jewish background, non-religious Jewish background, had a powerful initiation or mystical initiation into Christ, and had a love for the church, but would not enter the church. She said because there were too many ways in which it was still excluding people that she felt was, and she didn't want to belong. She was a very passionate person. She didn't want to be associated with an institution that she felt was rejecting or excluding people. Nevertheless, she loved it, paradox, and she certainly had discovered Christ in herself. And so out of that experience, she developed this insight into the contemporary spirituality that is evolving. And she called it the new holiness. And the resurrection is really all about pushing us forward into new kinds of holiness, new understandings of holiness. This is what she says. Today, it is not merely enough to be a saint. We must have a saintliness demanded by the present moment, a new saintliness, itself without precedent, a new type of sanctity is indeed a fresh spring or invention. If everything is kept in proportion, and if the order of each thing is preserved, it is almost equivalent to a new revelation of the universe and of human destiny. It is the exposure of a large proportion of truth and beauty hitherto concealed under a thick layer of dust. So here we have her insight, we could say, into what the resurrection is continuing to do, to renew the freshness of creation, to bring us back continually to that sense of wonder and discovery of God who is eternally creating. And I think if we put these 2 points together, the centrality of the resurrection in Christian faith, and for many Christians it isn't very central. What is more central would be Good Friday. They would see, and many other non-Christians would say, they go along with Jesus and with his teaching and with the gospel more or less up to the cross, and that is a noble and wonderful sacrifice, and it expresses, wonderful human values, and that's it. The rest is just magic, supernatural consolation. So for many people, the resurrection, which is the point of the story, and the new departure of the story as a living presence in human evolution, the resurrection doesn't really play a role. And I think even for many Christians, it's not very clear what the resurrection means. It may just mean that we will ourselves be resurrected one day. But it's much deeper than that. So, such a great mystery that we put us alongside this understanding of holiness, the goal of any spiritual practice in any religious tradition. The reason we are religious is to become holy, if we understand what holiness means. And again, sometimes we've thought of holiness as being more about conformity and approval by the institution. And saints become rather plaster saints as a result. But if we see holiness as the fullness of the particular manifestation that each one of us is, in other words, to be holy is to be yourself, and there are no two saints alike, really. If you meet a saint, you've met a unique manifestation, a unique talent for being human. And that is what, and we all have this capacity, of course, to be holy, because we all have this unique talent for being human. But we don't meet so many saints because there aren't many of us who actually accept that talent and use that talent and step out of the crowd and step out of the mold that we're all made in and become the unique person we're called to be. So the other aspect of holiness that related to the resurrection, which Simone Weil is talking about here, is a universality. And the resurrection might seem like, because it is the heart of Christian faith, it might seem to be specifically Christian. But the meaning of the resurrection is, of course, something that transcends the Christian label in a way. It has to, if we believe in the universality of Christ. It's a paradox, but we've been learning to live with paradox this week. So, such a great mystery, therefore, has to be continually explained and explored. We can't find one single definition or way of understanding it. It will be continually, if we remain faithful to it, it will continually open up new depths, and those new depths will be related to our own personal journey. Because this faith relationship we have with the risen Jesus is a very personal relationship. It's not an isolated or a private relationship, but it is a personal one. And because it has this universality, we are able, and I think maybe we need today, to be able to read, to understand, to be in dialogue with other traditions and other scriptures in the light of the resurrection. What we celebrate tonight is has an immense, although we'll be celebrating it in a religious form and a religious building, and many of us will have come to love those rituals and those scriptures and those words. Nevertheless, what we are actually celebrating is something that rewrites the whole meaning of religion. And it rewrites it by exposing the universality that Jesus throws open because of where he went today, deep down into the source of creation. So Jesus takes us away from the kind of religion which depends upon idols or idolatry or false consolation. Many people today don't identify themselves as religious. Nevertheless, they may not have religious idols, but we are all prone, religious or not, to idolatry, to false values or to false consolation, to things that give us a temporary relief from the headache of life or the suffering of life. And it's this. And religion has often been corrupted or devalued, degraded by becoming a source of false consolation for the suffering and the human condition. It's not to say that there isn't relief in true religion, but it's not a false consolation. This is why the resurrection doesn't just give us the false consolation of a new belief and that we have this superior revelation to other religions, but it pushes us continually into a new way of living. We go back to this life to live it in a new way. So we'll just conclude there with this idea of the universality of Christ revealed in the particularity of the resurrection. Something that is continuing to happen, and in which process the Christian people, for all their faults, are an essential element. The disciples Jesus had, that we've got to know a little bit during this week in the Passion narrative, were not the most faithful, not the most brilliant individuals. They ran away, one of them betrayed him. They were pretty human, with feet of clay, not unlike, at all unlike ourselves. What transformed them afterwards, as we'll see in the readings of Eastertide, the next few weeks, was the experience of recognizing Jesus risen. And as we'll see later, this experience of meeting the risen Jesus was often, first of all, an experience of fear or doubt or rejection. But when the penny dropped, when their eyes were opened and they recognized him and knew that he recognized them and accepted them for all their faults and didn't even mention their faults, then that empowered them with a new life, a new way of living. Their life became, of course, focused primarily upon communicating this experience and the good news behind it. So from becoming fearful people turned in upon themselves, frightened of persecution, frightened of failure, they turn inside out. And the new life they are living is the same life, but lived with a new purpose and a new energy. But we see them at other points in the gospel in their exclusivity. And it took them some time, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, it took them some time for the ones who were close to Jesus originally to really get the point that what had happened was a universal phenomenon, even though they had known it in a very particular, exclusive way, in their own tradition, in their own land. The significance of the resurrection launches Jesus into this universal figure. But listen to, again, the Gospel of Mark, this moment where, where's it gone? 38. So John, it becomes pretty universal later. So they're out on the road, Jesus teaching and healing. John said to him, "Master, we saw a man driving out devils in your name, and as he was not one of us, we tried to stop him." So where's your license for this? Where's your authorization? You can't just, do this in Jesus' name and claim, alliance, affiliation with us. Jesus said, "Do not stop him. No one who does a work of divine power in my name will be able in the same breath to speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is on our side." And then he links this directly to the idea we meet in chapter 25 of Matthew, the last judgment, when people are being evaluated on the basis of their compassion and how they fed the hungry and gave water to the thirsty and visited the sick and healed and went to prisons and so on. Anyone who gives you a cup of water because you are my followers, will not go unrewarded. So what matters is not the label, but the reality of the life that you're living. So, whoever is not against us is for us. Now, the early church struggled with this. There were people like Tertullian, and the early fathers of the church, who was a bit more, we might say, as a bit more of an exclusivist. He was so, impassioned by the gospel and by the person of Christ that he said we don't need anything else. Just, we don't need the Old Testament, we don't need the Greek philosophers, we don't need any other wisdom traditions. But, it would have been a rather more narrow-minded church if that had prevailed. But at the same time, there were people like Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, perhaps the first mystical theologian. Lived in Alexandria, which was this sort of boiling pot of different traditions and seminal point of dialogue and connection. Clement of Alexandria was a Christian humanist. He was the first theologian to speak about divinization, theosis, as the goal of human life, that God became human in order that human beings might become God, might become divine. And so Clement of Alexandria, just to pick him out as an example, shows us a universalist understanding of Christ. It's he who says that nothing that is not against nature can be against Christ. Nothing that is not against nature, so nothing that is, if something is not unnatural, then it cannot be against Christ. Sort of echoes a little bit what Jesus was saying about no one who is against us. So this gives us a key, really, I think, into understanding the universality of what we celebrate in the resurrection and in our faith in the resurrection, however tentatively we may be walking into that relationship and trying to understand it and trying to see how important it is for us. And just to end on this note, in the readings that we listened to during the vigil tonight, we see a biblical overview of the history of salvation. And at the beginning of that history, shortly after the moment of creation in Genesis, there is the sin, the fall of Adam. And one way of reading the whole of the Passion narrative would be to say this incurred such a huge debt of human guilt that only the incarnation and the suffering of Christ could pay that debt off for us. Well, it's a neat little answer, but it unfortunately doesn't fit the facts. It doesn't fit what the gospel is saying. So, the more universalist Christian perspective is expressed by Clement, and also actually Julian of Norwich uses the same metaphor. She said it's much more like this. They use this little metaphor or story. So God created Adam and Eve, and he sends him off on a mission. And Adam is really keen to accomplish this, like a son wanting to please his father and So he rushes off, but he rushes off so quickly that he doesn't notice where he's running, and he falls into a ditch. He gets caught in the ditch, he can't move, he can't get out. And so, what does God do? He doesn't, excoriate him, doesn't accuse him, doesn't punish him. There's enough punishment in what he's already done. The mistake he's made is punishment enough. He's miserable. So what God sends is the second Adam. This is what comes through the readings today. So Jesus comes, finds him in the ditch, and pulls him out of the ditch. And says, okay, now just try to be a bit more careful and don't fall into too many ditches from now on. It's a very different understanding of the history of salvation. And it's much more in tune with what we see about Jesus in his life and teaching as a healer, as somebody who puts things right, who restores things to health. And so Clement speaks about Jesus as the all-healing physician of human infirmities. The all-healing physician of human infirmities and the holy charmer of the sick soul. And the resurrection, therefore, is not to be seen so much as a reward or as some magical event, but it's a affirmation of the human capacity to be healthy in body, mind, and spirit, to be whole, to be fully alive. And that's, I think, what we celebrate this evening and tomorrow morning. So I read a little bit from Shantideva this morning, the Bodhisattva way of life. Bodhisattva, as I said, a figure, and many Buddhists would see Jesus as a kind of bodhisattva, somebody who relieves the suffering of humanity. And let me just read you another passage of this again. Quite sure where I began. In the spiritual energy that relieves the anguish of beings in misery and places depressed beings in eternal joy, I lift up my heart and rejoice. In the ocean-like virtue of the Bodhi mind that brings joy to all beings, and in accomplishing the well-being of others, I lift up my heart and rejoice. May any spiritual energy thus generated by my devotion to the enlightened ones be dedicated to dispelling the misery of living beings without exception. Okay, so we can network those issues a bit later. Let me just give a brief introduction to meditation. A couple of people are new here this evening, and some of you joining us online might like a short refresher. We meditate in a very simple way. We call the prayer of the heart, part of our contemplative tradition. And the essence of meditation, that being the prayer of the heart, is that we, as it were, get out of our heads. We lay aside our thoughts. So at the time of meditation, we're not actively thinking about God or ourselves or asking God for anything. Or those are other forms of prayer which are very helpful and enriching. But in the time of meditation, we move into the prayer of the heart. And this is This is a work of silence, if you like. So to let go of our thoughts is not as easy as it sounds, because our thoughts are constantly being produced. We're constantly thinking about something, living in the past, living in the future, daydreaming. So we need a simple way to lay aside those thoughts and just go step by step from the mind into the heart. And we do this by taking a word. This is sometimes called the prayer of one word, which we repeat in faith and faithfully and continually during the meditation time. You could take the name Jesus or the word Abba, for example. The word we recommend is the word Maranatha. Maranatha is an Aramaic word, which is the language Jesus spoke, and it means "Come, Lord." It's one of the earliest Christian prayers. So if you choose this word, you say it as 4 syllables, Ma, Ra, Na, Tha. You repeat it silently in your mind, in your heart, gently, without using force, but faithfully, which means that when you get distracted, which of course we all do, whenever you get distracted and you realize that you're thinking of something else, you drop the thought and just come back to the word. So it's constantly coming back to your own center and coming back to Christ in your own heart. So we say the word gently, faithfully, and attentively. We give it our full attention, but don't try too hard. And the essence of meditation is not to achieve anything. The fruits of this prayer will make themselves known to you, but the immediate goal is simply to keep returning to the word, like a child. We teach meditation to children many parts of the world, and children love meditation. They take to it immediately. Jesus told us to become like little children, and if we want to enter the kingdom. So this is why we call meditation simple. It is genuinely simple. And it's more the prayer of being than of speaking. It's just being ourselves and letting God be who God is. Okay. So that's what we'll do now. Take a moment to sit upright with your back straight. You want to be alert and comfortable. Close your eyes lightly. Just take a moment to be aware of your breath as you breathe in and as you breathe out. As you breathe in, as you breathe out. Just by paying attention to your breath for a few moments, you begin already to take the attention off your thoughts. It already begins to calm the mind. And then to go a little deeper and to sustain this, you take your word. You begin to repeat your word. The word again I'd suggest is Maranatha. Ma, Ra, Na, Tha. Ma, Ra, Na, Tha. Listen to the word as you say it and keep returning to it gently and lovingly. This is from the letter to the Romans. He's just reminded us that where there is sin, there is grace. So what are we to say? Shall we persist in sin so that there may be all the more grace? No, of course not. We died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? Have you forgotten that when we were baptized into union with Christ Jesus, we were baptized into his death? By baptism we were buried with him and lay dead, in order that, as Christ was raised from the dead in the splendor of the Father, so also we might set our feet upon the new path of life. Good. So we will be in the church at 9 for the vigil, and at about 7 for the at the standing stone in the middle of the island to see the new sun at sunrise, and then we come back here afterwards for a little breakfast and meditation, or maybe meditation and breakfast, depending on what time we come back. And that will be online too, so we welcome those of you who can join us tomorrow morning for the closing of the retreat and the last meditation. I'd just like to end today with letting you know about a very important event in the life of our community that's been unfolding for some time, and we're working on full steam, and that is our new center, our new meditation and retreat center at Bonnevaux in France, near Poitiers. And we already have a small community living there with some volunteers coming to join them, while the renovation work has begun, and that's our priority at the moment, is to keep that work going, and of course we rely upon people's support for that. If any of you would like to come and visit, we don't have a lot of accommodation there at the moment, but it's possible to stay nearby and join in the beginning of the life of the community there. You'd be very welcome, and if some of you would like to come and volunteer your time or your talents for the work that has begun there, and preparing the land and so on, you can do that by visiting the Bonnevaux website. I think we're just going to show you a few pictures. Okay, so it's a very beautiful place with a very wonderful energy. It was originally a 12th century monastery. From the 12th century until the beginning of the Benedictine life being lived there, contemplative life being lived there. And so in a sense, it's kind of called us back, I suppose, to renew that in a contemporary way. So we'll have a community of people living in the spirit of the rule of Saint Benedict, and part of that spirit of the rule is to welcome guests, and we'll welcome them both from within the community and beyond. And it's on the Camino, so there'll no doubt be people making a pilgrimage to Compostela who will stop there or start from there. But it will also be a place of dialogue with the secular world, the modern world, and our outreach into medicine and leadership and education will all be a focus of the conference center which we are building there. So I ask you to keep it in your thoughts, in your prayer, and come to visit. It's a home for the community, but it's also a place of peace for the world. As I say, we're just at the early stages of this, but if you'd like to come and visit and be part of those early days, you'd be very welcome. And if you visit the Bonvo website, you'll have more details and some links that you can follow through.